Okay, all right. So now, the moment we've all been waiting for. Um, Today, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Charlotte Halsema Ottinger, correct? Okay. She's the author of the extremely well-researched book about Madge Oberholtzer, the young Irvington woman who in 1925 brought down the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, D.C. Stephenson, and ended the Klan's influence in Indiana. Charlotte's going to tell us about some of the other interesting aspects of Madge's short life, and she'll touch on some of the legal precedents that resulted from Stephenson's trial for her rape and murder. And Charlotte, like Madge, lives in Irvington with her husband, Ron, and she is a history enthusiast and serves as a board member of the Irvington Historical Society. And she's a retired American Sign Language medical interpreter and currently works part-time as a nurse at the Indiana School for the Deaf. And in her spare time, I just love this, she fosters kittens. So now I'm going to quit talking and turn things over to our special guest, Charlotte Ottinger.
Thank you for inviting me. I haven't done this presentation for a couple of months because my husband just recently had brain surgery. So I'm a little rusty now, but he likes to come to the presentations because he lived with me while I'm doing all this research and he knows quite a bit about what I've done. And sometimes I forget some important points and he will step in and add them. I want to ask, first of all, are any of you familiar with the story about Madge Oberholtzer or D.C. Stephenson? Okay. Okay, D.C. Stephenson. I want to start by giving you a little bit of background about Madge's life because over the years, there have been several books and articles written about D.C. Stephenson, and Madge was always listed as kind of a footnote in the whole story. And through my research, I found out that she was quite a remarkable person and had also contributed a lot to the downfall of the Klan. And I really felt like her life experience and her sacrifice is meaningful and should be brought to the forefront, not just talking about Stephenson all the time. So first of all, Madge was born in southern Indiana in Clay County. She was brought to Indianapolis in the early 1900s, about 1901, 1903, I believe it was. Show me how to just click here.
I think you just click on it.
Okay. Okay. And this is kind of what Irvington looked like back then. This is the grade school that she went to, and that's the church that she attended. Her parents became very, very involved in the community quite quickly. She hung out with a group of students or other children in the neighborhood who were very influential. And at the time in Irvington, I don't know how many of you knew this, but Butler University was originally located in Irvington. That was their second campus, actually. And a lot of very important people and educators lived in the area. This is Mrs. Hilton U. Brown. Hilton U. Brown was on the board of directors at Butler University for over 50 years and also was the editor of the Indianapolis News. And so these were very prominent, well-educated women who mentored Madge and her friends. Another one of the mentors that she had was Grace Julian Clark, who was a suffragist and also a writer for the newspaper. Her father was a congressman in Indiana. He introduced the first legislation to provide women to give women the vote, even though they'd already earned it. This house is their house in Irvington, and it still stands. It's privately owned now, but there's a lot of great history in Irvington. Madge was very involved in the area. She and her friends would dress up a lot and do little plays in the local park. This is a picture of her when she was young, and I love the picture of her with her dog in the front. I like to show some of these pictures to humanize who she was because for so many years, she's just this enigma and nobody really knew anything about her life. Madge attended Manual Training High School. This is her high school picture. While she was in high school, and this was something that nobody had ever mentioned before in any research that I'd ever seen, and I uncovered this just by chance, she earned scholarships to study art. While she was in high school, she took classes on this scholarship at the Heron School of Art. And I don't know if you're familiar with any Indiana artists, but she had classes under Otto Stark, Clifton Wheeler, and William Forsyth, who are all part of the Irvington group and well-known Indiana artists. So she obviously had some talent in art. She also took additional classes that her parents paid for So I don't think that they would have, you know, it was a significant amount of money in those days, so I don't think they would have encouraged her if she didn't have some talent. Unfortunately, none of her art exists, and the remaining family members that are descendants of her brother had never even known this and had no pieces of her art at all. She then attended Butler campus, which was right there in Irvington. She could walk to campus. These were some of the original buildings. Of course, they're all gone now except for the original library, which is now where we house the Irvington Historical Society and Archives.
Would you go back?
Uh-huh. What would you like to see? It's an early picture. I don't know if they had another building prior to this, but this was about I'm thinking that was like 1906 possibly. This building is still there and now it's the Heron High School. They may have had a smaller location before this, but this is the only one I'm familiar with. Yeah, it's the same building, but now it's used as a high school. It's called Heron High School. My daughter actually went to the high school there. Let's see, where were we? One of her, I'm having trouble getting my. Is it moving? Oh, okay. This is one of her friends in high school that mentioned, you know, a little bit about her personality. So she had friends that she grew up with in Irvington that also attended college with her. So they stayed very close. She joined a sorority called Pi Beta Phi, which is actually the same sorority that I belonged to in college. And because of that, I was able to go to the Butler chapter archives for my sorority, which nobody else has access to unless they're members. And so I was able to get more information about Madge's life that other people aren't able to get to. This is her house in Irvington, and it's still standing and privately owned. It's been modified just a little bit. Her second house, yes.
How far away is it from DC's, the house that DC?
Approximately 4 blocks.
Mm.
Yes, not very far, but an awful walk
Yeah,
in
is
the
that
end.
the same street?
Yes, it's the same street. You have to cross Ritter, which is a kind of a main
Yeah.
street, and it's sort of a lot of the streets in Irvington are very winding. So if you ever came to Irvington and wanted to do a self-guided tour, you can get a map at the Irvington Historical Society, and it points out all the different,
You
different-
go around the block, really.
yes. And it goes past that little park that I showed you pictures of her in. About the time that Madge was in college, she ended up leaving college in 1917 prior to graduating, and it was because World War I was breaking out, or the World War, I should say, and a lot of men were leaving their jobs to go to war, and so those jobs were being filled with women for the first time, and she heard of an opportunity in Hagerstown to take a teaching position for a man that was leaving to serve in the military. And even on campus in Butler, and here, this is in Irvington, they had a large student army there. And this was basically right in our own backyards at the time. But she left to teach. She taught in Hagerstown for not quite a year. We have evidence that she might have even been considered the vice principal there, because we do have a copy of one of the diplomas from that period, and she has signed it as the vice principal, but she was also a teacher. So she may have had dual roles at the time. It's hard to believe that we could even find these kind of artifacts after 100 years now. After she came back from that job, oop, my bracelet just broke. Okay, let me take it off and I'll pick up the pearls later. She then came back to Indianapolis and started taking a series of jobs, most of them in the clerical area. This is a picture of her downtown. You can see vaguely the monument circle, Soldiers and Sailors Monument in the background, a group of people that she either worked with or were friends. This is her right here. One of the jobs that she had was with Eli Lilly for a short time. And I contacted I had never heard this before, but I was reviewing all the trial transcripts. And at one point, her father had mentioned that she had worked at Eli Lilly. So I contacted the Eli Lilly archivist to verify if that was true. And believe it or not, they still had her work record. They could tell me what department she worked in, what day she started, what day she ended. I mean, it was just phenomenal.
Can you imagine all the people that work for Eli Lilly?
Across the world, and they were able to still find this. And she only worked there, I mean, not even 6 months, but they still had her records. When she later joined the Indianapolis, the Indiana Education Department of Education, She was working down at the State House, and this was a woman that she met there named Ermina Moore, who played a significant role in her life from then on. Ermina was a little bit older. She worked specifically in an area called the Indiana Young People's Reading Associate or Reading Circle, where she would help select books that were sent out all over the state to underprivileged areas or areas that didn't have access to a lot of libraries. So she was very big in education and literacy issues and things like that. In her spare time, while she was working downtown, she also worked evenings at her old alma mater high school, teaching what they called a commercial class, which was like typing, stenography, things like that. She got $4 every evening that she taught. So she was very ambitious. I mean, by this point in her life, she was, out of college. She was a young, at that time, maybe 24-year-old. Most of her friends were getting married and having children, and she was still on a very, motivated track to be a businesswoman or a professional woman. She bought her own car with the money that she earned. Now, very few women drove back then, let alone bought their own car. She taught herself to drive. And then she and her friend Ermina took a 2-month trip out to California, back when the roads were very primitive. You would have to pack all the things that you needed for the trip, including things to maintenance your car, cash, because there's no ATMs at the time. And I mean, it was a very arduous trip for 2 women to take without any male chaperone with them. We don't know much about her trip, where she went there or what she did, but just the fact that she had the initiative to even make a big journey like that was pretty remarkable. Later on, she ended up meeting D.C. Stephenson at a banquet for the incoming governor, Ed Jackson. And at the time, and I'll get into this more, but
Uh-oh.
And that was a bad move. I'm so sorry. Don't know where to go.
Here, let me, allow me.
I think it was,
you can tell that I work the deaf, so I use my hands a lot. Want me to stick over here?
Yes, there we go.
I apologize.
That's okay.
While he's fixing that, do you mind if I ask you a
Sure.
question? For Millie, did I read, there's a bit of a glare here, did it say that she did a cleaning job?
She was in a clerical job,
Clerical.
but what I meant to mention
The ad.
that was the ad that was put out at the time that she took the job. So she obviously was responding to that job announcement. So DC Stephenson, he was not a very fine fella, but he did have a lot of charisma. This is one of his famous quotes. He came to Indiana and became the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1920s and quickly rose to the top. This was one of his first endeavors here in Indiana, in Kokomo, where they had a great big picnic with all these, Klansmen coming and family members coming. And this park is still there, but I don't think it obviously doesn't commemorate his event. Yeah, he flew into this event on an airplane, making a big show of everything. He really helped to promote the Republican Party. He helped to get Ed Jackson into the governor's position. He blackmailed a lot of people in the state to do what he wanted and kept a lot of files on them and photographs. He entertained in his home in Irvington, and it was during Prohibition, but he had lots of liquor flowing. He had women dancing naked. He did a lot of nefarious things behind the scenes. And even though the people in his organization knew what he was doing, they were covering for him or pretending it didn't exist. Does that sound familiar? Sorry.
At the time, at that time, people thought that he was a good man because a lot of people were, there were women who were wearing white dresses and were, they were lauding him.
Right. And he also promoted the sanctity of women's purity and the
Right.
family values. He pushed the organization, the Klan, as a civic organization, and many doctors, lawyers, he particularly courted ministers who then presented it to their churches. So it was considered, a wonderful Christian organization to join. However, it was focusing on themes like anti-immigration, anti-Catholic, anti-Black, but more anti-Catholic at that time. Kind of similar things that we're hearing in the press today about the whole 100% Americanism and that type of thing. Or America First was his agenda. The Klan grew exponentially, and he made money off of selling the memberships and the robes and all the attire. He became a multimillionaire at the time. This is, I just want to point out a few of these. This is, it's hard to see, but this is a Klan rally in Ohio. This is a Klan parade. These are women in the Klan. Down here is a Klan funeral in Huntington, Indiana, which is, oh, I'm sorry, I wrote it wrong, didn't I?
Yeah.
Huntingburg, which is down by Jasper, Indiana. And up here is another example of a Klan parade here in the Midwest. So it was very prevalent. Yes, it was right out in the open. And a lot of business people felt very pressured to join the Klan. They would put, for example, a local business would have the words or the letters TWK in the window indicating trade with the Klan. If you did not have that in your store window, you were kind of ostracized. So there was a lot of pressure to join the Klan so that you would maintain your business and livelihood. This is another example of, this is a Klan wedding over here and another Klan situation here. They had Klan groups for children as well. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you. This may not be on the, this is an example, and you can look this later, from Center Grove High School yearbook 1923, and this is their advertisement in the yearbook for the Klan Club. That's right here in our own area. Okay, when DC Stephenson started getting all this money, he decided to really live a grandeur life and wanted to copy his home after the headquarters for the Klan down in Atlanta. So he bought this house, which was originally the Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority in Butler, in Irvington, and he had it remodeled to look more like a Southern plantation type home. This home is still there and is privately owned also. He had bodyguards with him who later played big roles in his success. I should not really say it's success, but also in the crime that he committed. Yeah. After Madge met Stephenson at that banquet for the inauguration of Ed Jackson, she was called to his house one evening on what he called important business. She didn't want to go. She had just gotten home from a date with someone, but her mom insisted that she go because he said it was really important and he was leaving the next day. And to make a long story short, what happened was he abducted her with a few other men that were at the house, drugged her, took her on a train to what was supposed to be Chicago, but they ended up getting off in Hammond, Indiana. But during this trip up on the train, she was assaulted, raped, beaten, bitten all over her body. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But they ended up at the Indiana Hotel in Hammond where they stayed overnight. She decided at that time that she was going to take some poison to kill herself because she didn't know how else to get out of the situation. She had asked Stephenson to have someone take her to the drugstore or take her to a millinery to get a hat, because at that time, women never were out in public without a hat. And when she had left home to go to his house that night, she had not expected anything like this to happen. She didn't have her purse with her. She just had a coat on. She had no hat with her, nothing. So she used that as an excuse to go to get a hat and then asked the driver to take her to the drugstore. And at that time, this drug was sold over the counter as an antiseptic that you could dilute and use to clean things. It was also used as an abortifacient, I can't say the word, but a drug or a medicine that was also used to induce abortion vaginally, which he tried to use as an excuse later for why she had ingested it, even though that didn't fly. But she became so sick, and there's a lot more to this story. I'm kind of giving you the highlights. She became so sick that Stephenson said, we've got to go back to Indianapolis and get rid of this situation. She begged him to get medical help for her the whole way back to Indianapolis. and he refused to do it unless she married him, because he knew that if she married him, she couldn't testify against him for what had happened. And when he brought her back to Irvington, he hid her in his apartment above his garage overnight while she was still writhing in pain and her kidneys were failing. And eventually the next day he had one of his guys take her back to her home, and Dr. Kingsbury, the local doctor, was called to treat her. We'll talk about that a little.
Why was she spoken, like, why did he kidnap her in the first place?
He had taken her out on a date a few times after he met her, and it never really went anywhere. And he had told her at that time that, you know, he always got what he wanted, and, you know, made a few statements like that. Ron?
He had a history of.
Sexually assaulting women.
Now,
Kind of guy.
He had beaten up his first wife, and, you know, she had eventually divorced him. So he had a history of this, but no other woman had ever come forward about it, and no other men who knew what he was doing reported it either. He had several different women, and he also, I mean, if you happen to read my book, you'll see the different women that he had relationships with.
About him too, and I know.
Yeah, he had several women. Like I said, none of them came forward, and they were ashamed and embarrassed and scared because, and people often ask me, well, when she went to that millinery shop and when she went to that drugstore, why didn't she ask for help? Well, first of all, she was still in shock from all the injuries that had occurred. She had been drugged, and she also was aware of the power that he held in the state. And we can only guess what her motivation might have been to not get help, but she might have realized that he had the whole state of Indiana in his back pocket. He had, you know, she probably didn't know how far his reach was. If she had contacted the police while she was there, they could have been, you know, his right-hand men, and she would not have gotten the help that she needed. So she really just, I think, probably just felt stuck. Again, we can't know for sure what she was feeling, but all those factors might have come into play.
So clever to me to,
Pardon me?
my voice line is so clever to me to have.
Yes, yes.
That was me.
They thought she was going to die from this poison that she ingested, and she finally came before she knew she was going to die, before any of that became apparent that she was going to die. She decided that she was going to bring this to the courts and expose him for what he did, even long before she knew she was going to die. She knew that this was going to bring a lot of questions about her own personal life. It was going to possibly bring shame or, you know, negative press about her family, but she decided it was worth it because it needed to be stopped. Her attorney, Will Ramey, that's him, and this is her on her deathbed in her home. We haven't been able to prove this exactly, but the provenance indicates that it probably was her. I'm sorry, Asa Smith. Asa Smith was the lawyer friend of the family, and he's the one that took her deathbed statement, which is this just a partial copy of it where they had made some corrections on it, which we have in the Irvington Historical Society archives, the original one. Yes. What happened was they took notes while over a period of a few days, when they did think she was going to die, she would give statements about what happened, and she would just go, you know, through everything and tell bit by bit how this whole crime occurred. And when they finally, Ermina and Asa Smith sat at her bedside taking all these notes and then compiled them into a declaration, and then went back to her, I think at least 2 times, reading through it and asking her to either approve it or correct it or eliminate anything that they might have misunderstood, so that it was definitely her words, and then she signed the document. When she did die, the whole public came out to her funeral. This is her home. This is the people in the neighborhood who came to the funeral. Her sorority sisters from college were considered honorary pallbearers. Men that she had grown up with in Irvington were the official pallbearers. What were you going to say, Ron? Yeah, Ermina is that her right there? I can't see very well. Oh, up at the top with the flower basket, that's Ermina. At this point, they really thought that she had died from the poison that she had ingested, but we found out shortly after this that that was not the case. At this time also, when she came forward, people started questioning her morals and why did she go with him? What was she doing out late at night like that? But Butler College, all her friends, the president of Butler University, people in the community that had very good reputations came forward and spoke positively about her. Over the decades since then, they've gone back to some of the victim shaming. But when I went back to the original sources and really looked at, primary resources, it proved that she had an impeccable reputation. She had not done anything to question that. And I just wanted to put this here as an example of how people came forward publicly and supported her. Uh-huh,
The statement that she took and that she signed,
uh-huh.
did that come out before or after the death?
That came out after her death at the trial, I believe. Yes. And this is her attorney, Will Ramey. They called him the boy prosecutor because he looked so young. He had kind of bucked the Klan in the past because he did not like DC Stephenson and he spoke out against him. Very few in the Republican Party that did that. This is the jury, and the jury, they had to move the trial to Noblesville, Indiana, at that courthouse there. And the jury was a group of all men, some of which actually belonged to the Klan. But one of the quotes that I loved was that something to the effect that they may have been Klansmen, but they didn't believe in murder or murdering women especially. But it was an all-male jury, even though women had already received the right to vote and therefore also had the right to serve on a jury. They never called any women to be, interviewed to be on the jury. And their excuse that they used was that we didn't have a bathroom to accommodate them. But what they had done was take one of the bathrooms that they had there and make it into a press room. So they could have very easily made it into a women's bathroom if they had truly wanted women on the jury at the time, but it was still a new concept. So this was her family, her mother, her sister-in-law, her dad, and her brother, who all went to the trial almost every day. Her sorority sisters also attended the trial almost every day. And these were people that had testified against Stephenson. And I want to point out that some of these are African-American people, which would have been even more intimidating to step forward and do that. And so I always like to show this picture because I feel like they deserve equal accolades for what they did. They were, I can't specifically tell you who was who, but I believe he was one of the men on the train, the porters on the train. One of these was a housekeeper, I believe. He also worked at the hotel, and I believe she was also possibly a housekeeper at the hotel as well. But they all witnessed her in distress, looking drugged, those kinds of things. So they were all located in the Chicago area because that's where the train started. And they had to come down to Indianapolis or Noblesville at their own expense and step forward and speak.
Stay in other accommodations.
Yes, they couldn't stay in regular places. The Black individuals had to stay in like what they called the Black YMCA in Indianapolis and things like that. I mean, they were not assisted in any way to make it an easy effort to do this. This trial was covered all over the United States, also in Europe. At the time, they didn't have photographs in the courtroom or videotapes in the courtroom. And so there was a lot of editorial cartoons that were published in multiple newspapers.
One compared Stephenson to Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yes. And this is a quote from her dad, because people were like, why are you doing this? Specifically. I guess it's a repeat picture, isn't it? Here's an example of all the newspaper coverage. This is when they were found guilty, and I want to explain why he was found guilty of second-degree murder. She did not die of the poison that she took. At the time that she did die, her kidneys had almost recovered 100% function, and so they could prove that that was not what killed her. What she did die of, though, which was determined through the autopsy, was that the bite wounds that were inflicted on her by DC Stephenson's, particularly one up here by her breast, had become infected and caused a blood infection, basically sepsis. And at that time, antibiotics had not been invented yet, and so therefore they could only treat it with topical antiseptics. And so by proving that his bite wounds were the cause of her death, that's how they got him on second-degree murder. And a lot of people to this day still think she died of poison. So that's
his defense was if she committed or tried to commit suicide, he had no culpability in murder.
right. He tried to say she committed suicide, therefore he wasn't guilty. That was on her. But when they proved through the autopsy what she had really died of, then they got him. This is a picture of him in prison at Michigan City. This man was so charismatic that years later, a reporter interviewed him in the 1950s there and still believed that he was innocent because he was such a sweet man. After he went to prison, they started looking into some other nefarious activities in the government, Indiana state government, and they discovered the boxes that Stephenson had been hiding in some barn in, I think it was southern Indiana, that had all the evidence that he had kept on all these politicians to blackmail them if they didn't do what he wanted. And so he brought her testimony, and the discovery of these things brought down Ed Jackson and Mayor Duvall, along with a lot of other lower level politicians in the area. People in Indiana and across the Midwest, after they heard about his behaviors and his crime and all the corruption that was behind the Klan, started dropping out of the Klan left and right, burning their Klan uniforms out back behind the barn. I mean, it really dropped from something like several 100,000 members to 3,000 members within a very short amount of time. I think it was about at least 30 or 40% of white Protestant men in Indiana were members of the Klan at that time. He tried to get parole year after year after year, and it was denied. And I mean, this is an example of 500 women coming forward to keep him in prison. 5,000, I'm sorry, I can't read.
I think I read that when they took him to prison, they took him like, they took him in the car,
Uh-huh.
and it was a long leisurely car ride, and they stopped off along the way.
Well.
And it was just like, we're just going on a cruise.
The sheriff, or
Yeah, the sheriff.
the sheriff at Noblesville was very, it was in his camp.
We're going on a cruise.
Yeah, and Stephenson kind of buttered up the sheriff in Noblesville.
Yeah, he was given grand meals. He was.
Yes, and I also heard that he may have even paid off the sheriff's mortgage. So I haven't been able to verify that, but yes.
DC Stevens thought he was gonna get hard.
Yeah, he thought Ed Jackson would come out before he was
And when he
convicted himself. Yeah, he brought the black boxes out when Jackson didn't come forward and help him get out of prison. Marshall, her brother, and her mom testified at several parole hearings to keep him in prison. Unfortunately, her father died 2 years after she had died. A lot of people said that he died of a broken heart. While he was in prison, he actually earned his law degree and passed the bar in 3 different states. And so he decided to defend himself in court. And he wrote some books. He wrote all pamphlets, all kinds of things while he was in prison. He was released in 1956 after serving 31 years. There was a little interim in there. He was also released in 51, but had been arrested for trying to abduct a 16-year-old girl. That was one case, but the case that actually brought him back to prison was that he moved to another state and didn't let the parole board know exactly where he was. And so for that reason, they put him back in jail. The Indianapolis Times investigated all the corruption that was related to the Klan and the politicians in Indianapolis. And because of their investigative reporting, they won a Pulitzer Prize at that time. Madge totally kind of left the scene as far as any talk about Stephenson. I mean, everybody knew he was in prison because of the crime, but nobody really put any effort into understanding who she was or what she had gone through. But her legacy was pretty remarkable. And here's a few things that resulted from her trial and Stephenson going to prison. First of all, it prevented Stephenson from going to the White House, which was his ultimate objective. And he had said at one time when he was interviewed years later in prison, I think it was Will Ramey, her prosecuting attorney, who asked him, were you really wanting to go to the White House? And he said, yes, I did, but it would have been called something different than a presidency at that point. I would have been a dictator. Kind of echoing a few things we've heard again. Her testimony led to the decline of the Klan. And also the fact that prior to this case, they had never allowed deathbed statements or dying declarations in court. And they made an exception to the hearsay law. And therefore now these kinds of statements are allowed in court. It galvanized the efforts to regulate dangerous drugs because at the time that she bought that poison, it didn't say poison on there. It was over the counter. And as a result of this case, they started regulating medications a little bit more. The pills that she had taken were later reformed to look like little coffins, and it was clearly marked poison on the bottle from then on. Plus that somebody couldn't just buy it over the counter anymore. It also opened the door for other women to speak out publicly about sexual crimes, which was really not heard of much in the 20s. And her autopsy was the first autopsy presented as evidence in a trial in Indiana. They were accepting it in some trials in other states, not all the states, but in Indiana, hers was the very first one. And I was able to find a copy of her full autopsy. And then finally, the trial and specifically the cross-examinations, which I look at the cross-examinations now and I'm thinking, gosh, I would have asked this and this and this and this. But at the time, it was the way they conducted trials. And it was considered pretty remarkable cross-examination efforts. And so it's still, the trial and the cross-examinations are still studied in law schools today. So it's pretty remarkable what this case did.
Why don't we go touch on some of the medical people that.
Oh, well, I can't go into the details, but in the back of my book, I talk about the different people involved in this story and what happened to some of these people, because some of the people went on to do pretty remarkable things themselves. The doctor that did the autopsy had to move out of state because he was getting so many death threats. One of the doctors who worked with her related to her kidneys went on to be one of the leading experts in insulin, the use of insulin very early on when they had just started using it, and developed the diabetes clinic at Methodist Hospital, which is still there, and a camp for diabetic children called Bradford Woods, which is used for a variety of things now, but he established that. And one of the doctors who I can't remember, I think he was also a pathologist possibly, but Harger, he invented the first breathalyzer. It was called the drunkometer. And there's a rock with a plaque on it near the Fairbanks building at IU Health that commemorates him. I walked by it one day, I'm like, oh my gosh, I know about that man. So several of the men were working for Methodist Hospital early on and went on to do really remarkable things with their careers as a result. One of the women that Stephenson had dated, I use loosely, had been a resident at the hospital in the 20s and had just this overwhelming love affair with him, and he kind of dissed her, but she ended up committing suicide in the 1970s in a hotel in Indianapolis. So it's just really remarkable. One of his henchmen ended up getting murdered in Illinois. Marion Darr, who was supposedly engaged to him and had been caught on the side of the road in a compromising position with him, later left Indianapolis and went to Purdue, where she was an advisor at my sorority, not when I was there, and also had started a secretarial department there that they had not had before, and worked there for about 40 years. Never spoke about Stephenson, never mentioned anything about their relationship or anything. And
She's gonna sue them.
yeah, there was a book written in the late 80s by William Forsyth about Stephenson, and he had actually interviewed Marion Darr because she was still alive at the time, but she told him he was not allowed to use her name. If he did use her name, he was going to sue her.
I knew Bill.
But I figured out who it was because I went back to the Indiana Historical Society, went through tons of research and found her love letters and put the pieces together of her talking about being on the side of the road with her skirt up around her neck, stuff like that.
Was it in Indiana, or they were like on their way to Ohio or something?
Yeah, that was Ohio. They were in Ohio.
They were in Ohio.
Yes,
That's right.
yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, he had several different women. There was an incident in Ohio where he tried to attack somebody at a lakeside cabin, a woman. She was sleeping and he came upon her while she was asleep. I mean, just a variety. He tried to rape a manicurist in one of the hotels in Ohio. I think it was in Columbus. So there were quite a few incidents that had occurred, but nobody had ever come forward because of fear of retribution. Again, something familiar. Yeah, I mentioned that. Yeah, he beat his first wife. He had a daughter that he wouldn't claim for years. And then after he got paroled the first time, he went to live with her for a short time, even though he really didn't even know her. And after a month, he left because, as the daughter said, he just couldn't even really deal with reality at that point. But that's really all. I mean, there's so much more to this story. These are some of the highlights. She is buried on East Washington at the cemetery on East Washington Street to this day. And that's where they keep some of the records from early funerals and things. And they actually still had the records from her funeral.
Yeah, they had Mortuary, which one is it?
I forget what, Washington Park East, I think. Oh, Shirley Brothers are the ones that did the funeral. Yeah. And a lot of the pictures of those images are in my book too. Luckily, because I interviewed the grandchildren of Marshall, her brother, I was given some family pictures that had never been seen before, but they were very unfamiliar with the story themselves. They were shocked that anybody would even write a book about her because they had no idea. And I think that happened because when Marshall, he was so still traumatized by what had happened to his sister that even years later, when the first article came out in a book about this situation, he inscribed the book to his grandchildren, but he never spoke about it. He just gave them the book and that's all he could say. So I think a lot was lost because it was just too traumatic to discuss anymore in their family.
When did he die?
He died in, I think it was like right around 1960. Yeah, the whole family kind of gradually moved to Speedway, Indiana. And so they left the Irvington community after a while and, you know, a lot of things get lost in moves and
They retired.
yeah, he retired to Florida. But
Marshall had a construction company and did a lot of the bridge work.
yeah, my kids joke with me because we've all lived with Madge for the 4 years that I did the research. And at one point, totally unrelated, my daughter asked if I could do a little genealogy research about her husband. And I was just, you know, digging up a few things. And I said, you're not going to believe this, but your husband worked for Marshall Oberholtzer. And they're like, oh my gosh, not Madge again. But anyway, that's her story in a nutshell. Right now, Hamilton County, this is the 100th year since the trial, and Hamilton County will be doing a year-long commemoration, I don't want to say celebration, of the trial, reviewing what this all meant to our state and our country. And so that you might be hearing a lot of other presentations coming. Timothy Egan wrote a book called Fever in the Heartland, and he will be coming to speak about the Klan in the Midwest and also Madge. He used a lot of my research for his book and did to a very minor amount credit me. But he will be coming in town too to talk if you want another perspective of the story or more information about the Klan itself too. So anybody have any questions?
I have three questions.
Uh-huh.
What happened to Ed Jackson?
Ed Jackson, it was too late to actually send him to jail, but he did, and they wanted to try to remove him from office, but he stayed. He stayed. But he lost his reputation. I think he moved up to I believe it was him that moved up to the Castleton area when it wasn't the Castleton area and had a farm up there. But he lost, I mean, his reputation was shot. He never was in politics again after that.
Yeah, I was thinking, he didn't go to jail.
No, he didn't. And if
He didn't, I think it was like, I can't remember, because it was in the book that the guy that you just
Uh-huh.
mentioned. Freedom Highway.
Yes.
Yeah, and I couldn't remember what he had said.
Yeah, several people below him did go to jail, but I think it was something related to the timing of the trial and it was too late to put him in jail, but his reputation was shot by then. And you had a question?
Yeah, the markings around the frame of that. There. Is that the Greek outfit or just the design?
I think it's just the design of the frame. This particular portrait has belonged to the Oberholtzer family. It was one of the only things that they had left from Madge's life to even, they did have like a little settee that had belonged to the family. We actually have the Oberholtzer stove in the Irvington Historical Society archives because decades ago, and Irvington is obsessed with history, so somebody had removed it from the house and put it on the street for the dump. And somebody else came along and claimed it. And then it got passed to another family. So we have the provenance of it, but I mean, we hold on to stuff like it's gold in Irvington. So we do have her stove, and I have a cookbook that was put out in 1914 by the Irvington Methodist Episcopal Church where the family attended. And they put out a cookbook, you know, to raise money for a charitable group. And Madge's fudge recipe is in there. And I've got that identified there. It was hard to find that cookbook. But this is the portrait that was hung in the Oberholtzer family home for many years. And it was passed down to the children and then to the grandchildren. So when I met with the grandchildren of Marshall's grandchildren, they still had this and it had been kind of passed around between them, but they always still had it up in their homes. And we have their family Bibles with all their family histories in them. And the pictures from the funeral, A couple had been used before that had been in the newspaper, but these were their private photos that had never been published. And they gave me full access to those, and all the materials that they gave me, I in turn gave to the Irvington Historical Society with the family's permission to keep them in their repository from then on.
So the material that was recovered in the black box that he used to blackmail?
Yes.
people, what were those blackmail?
He had pledge cards where they had to pledge loyalty to him. He had records of money he had given them. For example, during the campaign for Ed Jackson, he had bought him a car. You know, he had bought him several different things, paid for a lot of his campaigning in illegal ways. I mean, he had photographs, supposedly, I read that he had photographs of people at his parties, which would have been, yeah, drunk and in compromising situations. I've never seen any of those materialize. I don't know if they truly existed, but the research showed that at one time he did have materials like that he held over people's head to get them to do his bidding. Some of them went to jail. Some of the politicians went to jail. Just the general Klansmen, really nothing much happened. The two henchmen that I showed in the picture, they were retrialed for kidnapping charges and were exonerated for some reason. I don't understand at all why. Like I said, that one met his fate anyway when he was murdered, so.
Clint was from,
Yeah.
Earl Clint was from Evansville, and he went back down there and lived, I think he was at one time a police officer.
Yes, before this. But I wanted to point out too, something about Earl Gentry was the man that actually went on the train with Stephenson and Madge, and they were all in one compartment with heavy doors and things like that. The whole time that Stephenson was raping her and beating her up, he was in the upper berth and did absolutely nothing. And to this day, I don't understand why he wasn't held as an accomplice or something, but he was released and not found guilty of anything. And I to this day, I don't understand why, because he was obviously
For
right there.
payback, he moved up to Michigan or Wisconsin.
Wisconsin,
Wanted to live with an older woman
that he took advantage of financially, and she had him killed.
killed by a paid assassin.
Yeah, basically it was a workman for this woman, and she paid him to kill him.
But she had been nice to him and so.
Oh, yeah, and he had taken advantage of her. I mean, there's a history. He had been married multiple times, and at the end of his life, when he had been released, he moved down to Tennessee and married another woman who had no idea about anything related to his past. I don't know how that could be, but when he died, bringing fruit up to the house from the car or whatever, and had a heart attack in the driveway. He was buried in a military cemetery in that area because he had been in the military, although he had never served overseas. And decades later, when they realized that they had buried a criminal, a felon in their cemetery, they didn't move him, but they made a point of saying we never would have done that if we'd known that.
What I find interesting is at the age of 33, D.C. Stephenson was worth $900,000, which is in today's money would be about $30 million. He had all that, and he just blew it. I mean, he was so intent on,
Being rich and powerful.
being rich and powerful that wasn't enough.
And something else I want to point out too about Stephenson, he didn't really care that much about the ideology of the Klan. It was a mechanism to the power and the money that he wanted.
Right.
In the same way that some of our recent politicians have done, he started out as a Democrat, moved to being a socialist, couldn't get the votes he wanted to be elected to anything, so then he moved to being a Republican.
Right.
So it wasn't about the ideology of the Klan or that particular political group. He was moving between these groups to find the one that would get him the power and the money that he wanted. It wasn't necessarily what their beliefs were. Yes, he moved here from Texas, and there's very little, I had to analyze information for months to figure out his family history, his genealogy, where he actually had come from, because he really wanted to divorce himself from any of his past and present himself as this successful, charismatic, well-educated military hero, which he wasn't. He was born of sharecroppers in Oklahoma who lived in a dugout in the ground. his mother was an older mother and he was very embarrassed of her and ashamed of her. And totally, even in later years, people asked him to send some money to his mother, who was just destitute and even into her 70s was working as a waitress, just trying to cobble enough together to live. And he refused to send her any money.
That's what I had to do when I was researching it too.
And the other thing too about him in his early life, I just lost my thought, but anyway, any more questions?
So what is your impression from all the research that you've done, which of course is probably, or maybe not, but gentry that was, you know, in the, whatever you called it, the upper area while this is all going on, and then the house that he brings her back to and puts up in the room, it's like, he probably could, even though he's a big man, he couldn't have done that by himself. Did you ever get the impression, because the two girls, Lincoln,
Gentry,
Gentry, that they were outright acquitted? Did you ever get the impression that that somehow they had called in a card from somewhere in the relatives of, you know what I'm saying? Like why was he, I remember, why was he charged with second degree murder, not first degree murder? Because he obviously,
Well, first to be premeditated.
Yeah, to first it had to be premeditated murder, and the second degree murder got him for causing the murder, but not the
Right.
premeditation of the murder. Because he had not intended to kill her. That was not his objective.
biting the heck out of her. and-
Right, he was just a
He-
sexual
he actually-
deviant.
He actually, when he sobered up a little bit.
He
they slept
apologized and-
at- They traveled at night. It was a Sunday night. They got up Monday, ordered some breakfast, and he started sleeping it off. And what's interesting is they slept during the day. They left at 5 o'clock on Monday. And when he was starting to get better, he said,
I was a brute. I'm sorry, I was a brute. And she said, you were 10 times a brute, you know, that doesn't even excuse your behavior.
there was a one time that she had a gun. She picked up his gun and was able to shoot him.
And she thought it would cause too much embarrassment to her parents if she had murdered somebody.
Yeah, so, you know, and what's really interesting was her mother and father already, before they woke up, before they even got to Hammond, they were concerned about
Her missing, because this was an adult woman who still lived at home. She had never gone anywhere overnight without telling her parents where she was going. They knew something was wrong because she had, you know, people often say, well, she shouldn't have gone with him. Well, she didn't plan to go with him, obviously. If any woman in her right mind that was going to spend a night with some man or go on a trip with a man, she would have had a bag with toiletries or undergarments or a change of clothes or something. I mean, it's just common sense that shows you that she was not planning, this was not something she agreed to.
Sunday night.
Yeah, and the thing that I point out also is, okay, all things equal, suppose she did agree to go with him. Suppose she did go over there willingly. She still didn't
Sure.
she still didn't ask to be molested and chewed from head to toe. They said that I mean, in my book, there's a page that shows I had it created based on all the evidence in the trial and everything, where I had a diagram of all the injuries on her body after this. And she actually had a bruise on her hip that was the size of a dinner plate. In addition to all the bruises, the bite marks on her face, on her chest, down to her ankles. I mean, she didn't consent to any of that. So regardless of if she had agreed to go, there was still a crime.
Then there's the abortion.
Yeah, he tried in 1930, when he was up for parole again, he tried to bring it back to court, or he did bring it back to court and tried to say, well, I gave her money and a car to go up there to get an abortion. Well, there was absolutely zero evidence. And as a nurse, I went through all the information, the medical information, nothing lined up with. On her deathbed, they had indicated she had had a menstrual cycle. Therefore, there's no way she could have had an abortion 2 weeks before that. I mean, a lot of things, just now that we have information about medical science and stuff, we can tell that there was no case. And if she had used that poison as an abortion method, there would have been evidence on examination. And she obviously had sores and, you know, deterioration in her mouth from ingesting the poison orally. So that was a moot point. And the judge was so disgusted by Stephenson even trying to present this as a way to get off. He was disgusted by it and totally wouldn't even listen to the case.
Did you already cover this, but because I think when he was like 70 at the time of she was like 16 or something, but whatever happened to his last victim?
The last victim?
The last one,
Oh, the 16-year-old that he
Right.
tried to abduct in,
Right.
I think it was Minnesota.
Right.
She was walking along the street and he was in a car and, he tried to like pull her into the car. And she took off running, screaming, and people heard her and saw what had just happened. He tried to say that he was, just asking for directions. And at that time, because they, they're just people, it was a different time. The judge said, I want $300 in cash and you need to leave the state. And that was the only punishment that he got.
Tell him what his widow said about ice cream.
Oh, yeah, his widow, when he died in Tennessee and somebody, in the 1970s, some local papers here in Indianapolis were trying to locate where Stephenson was at the time. They didn't realize he had already died in 1964, I think it was. So they went back and found his widow in Tennessee and interviewed her, and she said she had no idea about any of this. And she goes, he was just the nicest, gentlest man. He would pick children up in his van, even black children, and take them to get ice cream. And I'm like, red flag, major red flag, but it just, I read back on some of these original texts and interviews and things, and I'm just like, oh, it's just frightening. Any other questions? Well, I greatly appreciate you inviting me here because I always enjoy having a chance to talk about Madge and bringing her to the forefront where she deserves to be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's two.
Yeah, I'll pick up my pearls.
Oh, there's two like at your feet, Diane.
I was just bragging to my husband,
I
I made this bracelet several years ago, and obviously I knew it was free.
Yeah, there's three more behind you.
And
Yeah, I'm gonna.
I do have a few copies of the book if you'd like to buy one. Half of the proceeds go to the Irvington Historical Society to maintain their collections.
So I actually live in Irvington.
Oh, you do?
Yeah,
Oh,
I live right near
familiar.
Ellenberger. I live right near Ellenberger Park.
Yeah, I think I've seen you at different, how Irvington is, we probably have seen you.
Could be, yeah.
Yeah.
But we're, here, actually, I need to,
What is your name?
Elizabeth San Miguel.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Right.